Good evening, everyone. And before I begin, I must once again thank Overman Foundation for giving me the opportunity to deliver these talks. And today I'm going to continue with a discussion on the chapters of the future poetry by Sri Aurobindo. And today my focus will be on other aspects of poetry and poetic creation, basically rhythm and movement. In the third chapter of the future poetry called Rhythm and Movement, Sri Aurobindo continues to discuss the aspects of poetry, focusing more on its different techniques. Now, rhythm, movement, and meter form part of the art of writing poetry. Sri Aurobindo himself, being not only a great poet but a lover of poetry too, he himself experimented with various metric measures in his own poetry. He feels meter is the right physical basis for the poetic movement and discusses here this aspect of the poetic technique. To begin with, he contrasts the value and use of meter in poetry with wir Liber, that is, poetry written in what is called free verse. Now, advocates of this wir Liber movement set aside any kind of meter as a limiting bondage. They feel there's a natural poetical rhythm, and any kind of metric formula falsifies and takes away from the freedom of the natural rhythm. Now, free verse claims to follow the rhythms of natural speech, disregarding any metrical or musical pattern. And practitioners of free verse or wir Liebe do not find themselves obliged to adhere to rigid and complex rules of poetry. Each poet creates his own form and pattern. So that is the way with the practitioners of free verse. But even here, the achievements have been considerable in some poets, say Whitman, Ezra Pound. Sri Aurobindo's view is, however, a bit different. He says, Wir Liber is okay, free verse is suitable for poetical prose, and that's as far as its aim in rhythm should go. It is also good when it bases itself upon the irregular and complex metrical movement like that of Greek choric poetry. Now, this type of lyric poetry usually used to be performed with the accompaniment of a lyre or other instruments and was sung during religious or social occasions. And sometimes this could be forceful and powerful, and we have many Greek poets who composed this type of poetry. Sri Aurobindo goes down in time a little further and citing John Milton, Milton's example, he says that in his later poetry is without rhymes. He says Milton forgot the value of rhymes in later life. For instance, consider these lines from Samson Agonistes, which is otherwise very beautiful poetry, where Milton writes, ease to the body some, none to the mind, from restless thoughts that, like a deadly swarm of hornets armed, no sooner found alone, but rush upon me thronging, and present times past, what once I was, and what am now. So there is, see, the slow rhythm of contemplation. There is substance for thought also, but without that proper rhyme, the rhyming words, we feel that perfection is just lacking somehow. In fact, we would expect it to rhyme. So let us look at some lines from another poet, Walt Whitman this time. His poetry also exhibits sometimes similar errors when he writes in The Leaves of Grass. For him I sing, I raise the present on the past. As some perennial tree out of its roots, the present on the past. With time and space I him dilate and fuse the immortal laws to make himself by them the law unto himself. So now there is modern meterless verse, Sri Aurobindo says, catches up the movements of prose mainly and tries to fit them into varying lengths of verse. In fact, in a letter Sri Aurobindo had written about modern poetry, that it is carefully written and versified, often researched in thought and expression. But it has its own drawbacks too. It lacks the inspired phrase and inevitable word, and also the rhythm that keeps a poem forever alive. And Sri Aurobindo further wrote about modern poets that they wrote poetry from the cultured, striving mind and not from the elemental soul power within. Now, uh, it is what he wrote so many years back. It is true in most cases. So, rhyme is not only an adornment, not only a technique. According to Sri Aurobindo, rhyme has sometimes a spiritual value too. When we listen to regular beats, when we listen to melodious rhyme, some sealed doors to the sources of inspiration open for us. Rhyme has the capacity to reveal beauty to us, to that supra intellectual something in us, Sri Aurobindo says. This power to suggest the beauty is akin to the power of music, which also awakens in us the spiritual aesthetic sense. Or simply consider nursery rhymes. That is, children grow up with them. The ears from the very beginning get attuned to the beat and music of the rhymes. And every language has its own rhymes and folk songs and lullabies. So, what does rhyme actually do? In the case of children, for instance, every child has at some time or the other recited recited Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. They do not understand the meaning of the words. They catch only its sound and memorize the combination of sound and rhythm and rhyme. So the purpose of rhyme is to neatly put into a fixed measure the thoughts and ideas and feeling. The recurring measure appeals to our senses, and it also sharpens the faculty of memory in us as it aids in learning and memorizing faster. In fact, even children quite easily follow the given stress pattern in the rhyme. And Sri Aurobindo tells us that this recurring measure of sound, that is, wherever it is used, displays a subtle psychological truth. Because see, meter and rhyme are sort of measured and countable qualities, and occurring at equal or regular time intervals have a pleasant effect on the mind. And repeated sounds create the melodious effect in a poem. And the way the technique of rhyme and sound is used by a poet, it helps to enhance the mood of the listener or reader, or it may also act otherwise. That is, it appeals to our emotions in the way the poet wants it to appeal. In fact, this theory was valid and prevalent in the Vedic tradition too, and in those times, sound was given great importance in our ancient tradition. In fact, the original sound is related to the very conception of the universe. As we see, much of the effect of the mantra is due to the chanting of it. And we know how sacred is the syllable Om. The Gita says that it is there eternally in all sacred rites of sacrifice. So, sound is associated with vak or speech in the Vedic texts. And sound is also associated, and this is a very important point that Sri Aurobindo makes, that sound is also associated with the speaker and with his consciousness, and more so with the consciousness of the hearer. So, as we have briefly discussed in one of our earlier talks, that is, the consciousness of the reader, the hearer, is very important. So, It is thus that everyone cannot chant a mantra properly, everyone cannot understand a mantra properly, everyone cannot get attuned to its music in the proper way. So, the consciousness of the creator and the consciousness of the listener both are equally important. So, Sri Aurobindo says the ancient poets, our ancient poets, preferred to compose in different meters and made use of rhyme not only to aid memory, but also because they discovered in metrical speech an easier durability and a greater natural power than in unmetrical speech. So, meter adds to the value of sound, and language and sense get heightened and become intenser because of the use of meter. So, we have in the Vedas the theory of the word, the speech associated with the spirit of creation. The entire universe moves on certain rhythms. This, even the scientists will tell us. So all movements are governed. In our ancient texts, they believed all movements of the universe are governed by what we call chand. The ancient poets had discovered this. And because of this, because of the fixed rhythms of the formative word, world movements endure. Our ancient texts have discussed the creative power of Shabd. For instance, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad talks about the Shabd Brahman. It says, speech verily is Brahman. The higher Brahman is in truth speech. So, in an attempt to define Brahman, the sage identifies him first with speech. The Rig Veda also sings hymns to speech or word. For instance, this shlok beginning with these words, where the poet says, no part in Vak hath he who hath abandoned his own dear friend. Here also we see how Vak, that is speech, is held as the sacred word. Now, Sri Aurobindo also talks about this harmony, and he says that this balanced harmony, maintained by a system of subtle recurrences, is the foundation of immortality in created things. And his own works, poetical works mainly, display this harmony amply, making most of his poetry immortal. So, like these lines, which I'll quote from Savitri, where he's writing, in spite of death and evil circumstance, a will to live persists, a joy to be. There is a joy in all that meets the sense, a joy in all experience of the soul, a joy in evil and a joy in good, a joy in virtue and a joy in sin. So look at its chant like quality, and this chant like quality implants that very joy within us as if. So, when we're talking of metrical movement in poetry, this metrical movement is thus creative sound, and it is powerful and such that it knows its own powers. But here, we may be misguided. So, Sri Aurobindo points out a misconception regarding meter and metrical compositions. The essence of true poetry consists not in only its metrical aspect. So, that is anything and everything set in a metrical form, which may be catchy and attractive, cannot be called poetry always. Rather, it is not true or high poetry. Take the instances of nursery rhymes or any simple verse which relies only on rhymes. These may not be assigned a rightful place in the realm of true poetry. And Sri Aurobindo mentions the instances of French metrical romance or medieval English medieval ballad poetry, which depend heavily on their metrical beat. So let's listen to these lines from an English ballad. I'll do as much for my true love as any young man may. I'll sit and mourn all at her grave for a 12-month and a day. So, ballads actually are very melodious and musical and are part of the popular culture. Ballads could be interestingly narrative too, and their song like meter and rhythm made them fit for dance performances also. So they are very musical. Okay. So, but not only in these old verses, in later European poetry also we find this reliance on meter for rhythm and charm. And Sri Aurobindo tells us that only meter, that is the heavy reliance on meter only, cannot go take us very deep or high, because meter, rhyme, these are necessary at times, these are okay, but no real soul movement can fit into this mold. So proper meter and good rhyme and attractive sound, these are good enough, he says, when poetry is nothing more than an echo of life. So these accoutrements of poetry, these rhetorical devices, are necessary perhaps, but are not sufficient or have power enough to stir the soul. At best, they touch our vital chords only. And these are suitable for metrical romances or war poetry or patriotic poems. So let us look at a few examples, say one or two examples. So, one I can think of is Walt Whitman's very popular poem beginning, O Captain, my Captain. So, addressing his dead captain, the poet sings in a rush of emotions and he says, O Captain, my Captain, rise up and hear the bells. Rise up, for you the flag is flung, for you the bugle trills, for you bouquets and ribboned wreaths, for you the shores are crowding, for you they call the swaying mass, their eager faces turning. So, see how the poet's love, his loyalty, how it is all expressed so wonderfully through the rhyming words and the rhythm. So, this kind of a poem touches and arouses some similar emotion in us, but that is its limit. So, lines like these make good poetry, but can satisfy our outer ear only. They do not sink into the depths of the soul. And Sri Aurobindo says this is an error which even good poets become prone to when they rely on a set harmony or set melody and are content to compose with and within these limitations. These may give us beautiful poetry with aesthetic value and with the capacity of fulfilling at least one function of poetry, that is, of giving pleasure. But that's where it must stop. It cannot be what we call genuine poetry, which has a deeper appeal, an intenser appeal. For instance, consider these beautiful lines from a Victorian poet where he says, there is sweet music here that softer falls than petals from blown roses on the grass, or night dews on still waters between walls of shadowy granite in a gleaming pass. Music that gentlier on the spirit lies than tired eyelids upon tired eyes. Music that brings sweet sleep down from the blissful skies. Very beautiful, Tennyson, The Lotus Eaters. So it's good, it's beautiful, it's charming because of the rhyme and meter and imagery and rhetorical devices, but does not touch the deepest being in us. In Sri Aurobindo's words, the soul is not suddenly seized and carried away into unknown depths. So, lines which do stir the soul in us come from a higher source. Listen to these lines from one of Sri Aurobindo's poems. Out from the silence, carrying with thee the ineffable substance, carrying with thee the splendor and wideness, ascend, O Spirit immortal. So it's almost like a command for the spirit to ascend to the heights. So, but still, we may say meter and rhyme we cannot altogether dispense with, as they are not only artificial elements, not only the outer garb of poetry, but Siorimba says the emotions and feelings can be sometimes powerfully expressed in a balanced rather than in a loose and shapeless rhythm. But even here, the beauty of the composition of any poem derives much from the substance of the poem. Sri Aurobindo says if the substance is adequate, then technique gives it greater beauty. So we have ample display of this kind of ordinary metrical scale, and Sri Aurobindo calls it ordinary in the poetry of English Victorian poets. So we may quote in plenty because there are plenty, but we must listen to a few only here. So listen to these lines when the poet sings: ring out the old, ring in the new, ring happy bells across the snow. The year is going, let him go, ring out the false, ring in the true. And we can go on singing lines like these from the beautiful poem In Memoriam by Tennyson. So, this kind of metrical scale is displayed in other poets of the era too. For instance, these are from Matthew Arnold, where he's saying, with aching hands and bleeding feet, we dig and heap, lay stone on stone. We bear the burden and the heat of the long day and wish it were done. Not till the hours of light return, all we have built do we discern. Beautiful metrical pattern over here we find. So these are some instances where the thought and substance are beautified by the melody, and the metric lines in turn gain substantially because of the content. So these are by very skillful artists, no doubt, accomplished and vigorous craftsmen. And Sri Aurobindo says they display the metrical skill or the skill of the classical or romantic technician. And the poet here becomes more of the melodist and harmonist who strives for perfection in rhetoric and meter. So they sometimes these poems, when we look at them, they sometimes look like exquisitely and finely crafted sculpture with their meter, their rhyme, and the imagery. So read Tennyson, for instance, or even Browning. Theirs is beautiful poetry. The images and the melody may haunt us for a while. Our vital may respond aesthetically to this poetry, and really it does. Yet it lacks that deeper element, that touch of the soul, which may raise it to the realm of higher and true poetry. Sri Aurobindo says what is lacking here, except in rare moments, is the soul behind creating and listening to its own greater movements. So there are two factors in poetic rhythm, and of the two factors in poetic rhythm that Sri Aurobindo wrote about in a letter, one is technique, definitely. That is the adornment of rhyme and meter, which gives a poem much of its beauty. The other factor, however, is more important. That is the secret soul of rhythm. And this, Sri Aurobindo says, can be found by listening into what is behind the music of words and sounds. So we turn back once more on the theory of the active role of the inner soul in us in poetic creation. So, uh, so far what we have gathered, that is we have talked about metered verse, we have talked about free verse, and we have talked about rhythm. So what we find is, in a nutshell, if I were to say, that is metered verse, metrical verse is better than free verse, and rhythmical verse is definitely better than metered verse also. So Sri Aurobindo once wrote that There are two kinds of inspiration in poetry. One is the inspiration of language, and one is the inspiration of rhythm. Either of these is not alone sufficient, but must fuse together for the achievement of poetic perfection. And this poetic rhythm goes beyond mere meter and rhyme, beyond the aesthetic pleasure afforded to our outer ears. The highest levels of poetic rhythm come from a yearning of the soul. There is a direct demand of the soul for a higher rhythm and a profounder satisfaction. Then the inner ear begins to listen to this poetry and learns to respond to it in a different way. The soul creates, the soul listens. Listen to these lines from Sri Aurobindo's Savitri again. He is the wisdom that comes not by thought. His wordless silence brings the immortal word. He sleeps in the atom and the burning star. He sleeps in man and God and beast and stone. Because he is there, the inconscient does its work. Because he is there, the world forgets to die. This is one incantatory verse in Sri Aurobindo's Savitri, where he is attempting a description of the Supreme Absolute. And lines like these are the result of the deep vision of the soul. And it is the receptive soul only who can get through the meaning of the words. And this poetry, with its soul stirring rhythm, is far away and much higher than ordinary poetry. It is different also from prose rhythm. Prose rhythm, as Sri Aurobindo tells us, has to do more with a general harmony. It aims at a total perfection, a total effect, often at the cost of neglecting its parts. But when perfection in poetry is aimed at, when it is true poetry, there every sound is utilized to its limit for its effect, and the combined effect of all the sounds and syllables produces the highest and intensest rhythm. And this is possible only when poetry comes from deep within the soul. So, allow me to quote here some lines from Savitri yet again. Visva Bharati writes, "For the spirit is eternal and unmade, and not by thinking was its greatness born, and not by thinking can its knowledge come. It knows itself, and in itself it lives. It moves where no thought is, nor any form. Its feet are steadied upon finite things. Its wings can dare to cross the infinite." Now, we can compare these with the sound and rhythm of ordinary prose and poetry. And I'll read them laying the proper accent and stress according to meter. And the difference in rhythm is quite visible, quite audible. This is from one modern poet. He writes, "It has rained all day long, and now evening descends on earth. The desolate wind goes weeping through the empty streets. My world too feels empty and fills my heart with restlessness, for ghosts of vanished dreams flit there with evanescent pain." Or take these lines from another modern poet where he's writing, and it's very prose like. The structure of this poem is very prose like. He says, "I have traveled all the lonely highways in the autumn and watched all the lonesome cities pale at dusk. I have held all those tired strangers in my waves and whispered stranger secrets now forgotten. This gypsy satchel carries all my sorrows. This fatigued evening carries all my songs." So, whatever they be, descriptive or subjective, their rhythm doesn't endure for long. We read and ponder and also enjoy for a while. They do not etch anything permanent in our heart. So, evidently, this kind of poetry is bound to suffer from its own defects. In a letter of 1943, Sri Aurobindo wrote what he had observed about the tendency of the modern mind. He found there were two tendencies in the modern mind. the over intellectualized, over sensualized, decadent that makes for death, and also the spiritual which may bring rebirth. So, and Sri Aurobindo says, a true poem contains something more than ordinary rhyme and meter. It has that rhythm. Okay, so we are going to talk more about rhythm today, as we said in the beginning, rhythm and movement. So, a true poem contains, as Sri Aurobindo says, more of rhythm, that rhythm of poetry which we can feel and not just hear or listen to with our outer ears. This rhythm is different from the rhythm of song and music also. The rhythm of poetry helps that to come out, to be revealed, which lies hidden behind the words. That is the inner content, a soul feeling, Sri Aurobindo calls it, a soul experience, which is conveyed through the rhythm. And Sri Aurobindo says that this kind of life feeling or life experience or a vision or even a mental emotion, when this can be reproduced, when the vibration of this inner experience can be caught and conveyed through the rhythm, only then a poem gets its full significance and meaning. Sri Aurobindo focuses on rhythm as an important component of poetic movement. He says it is the first and an indispensable element in poetry, and a perfect rhythm often gives value to a poem even when the vision and style are not very, very high. For instance, as he says about Homer, the Greek epic poet, that English translations of his passages read more like ordinary poetry. They must be read in the original because Homer gets the best part of his effort from his rhythm. But as we noted earlier, it is not mere metrical rhythm that Sri Aurobindo means here. The metrical rhythm is only a physical basis. The poetic rhythm of Aurobindonian poetics calls for a deeper, a subtler music of the soul, the rhythmical soul movement, entering into and building up the meter which satisfies the soul, the inner hearing. It has to sink deep in. This is the kind of rhythm Sri Aurobindo means. And in one of his letters, he explained this poetic rhythm. He said, it is sense of a rhythm which does not begin or end with the line, but has forever been sounding in the eternal plains. It returns into the infinite to go sounding on for ages after. So, as in these lines of Sri Aurobindo himself, let's see when he's prophesying the state of life when super consciousness will be the mode, and he writes, "And truth shall be a sun on nature's head, and truth shall be the guide of nature's steps, and truth shall gaze out of her nether deeps when Superman is born as nature's king." Or take these lines from the Isha Upanishad, the opening verse, the invocation, where the poet says, Om Purnamada Purnamidang Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnam Iva Vashishyate. Even the form, when you look at it written in Devanagari script, even the form looks perfect. So, this is the labor of the spirit that the ancient seer poets had achieved. And Sri Aurobindo says the poet must achieve this labor of the spirit, the substance, thought, vision, all must surge out of the eternal depths, and these shaped into poetry. Only then true poetry is created. The metrical movement is there, but only as the base, the adhar, we can say. It contains within it, or it is contained within something higher, some greater music which is more than mere poetic meter. Sri Aurobindo says, and I'm just quoting his words here, very beautifully written. He says, The conductor of the orchestral movement is the soul suddenly and potently coming forward to get its own work done by its own higher and unanalyzable methods. So these words are their own explanation. Any attempt to dissect and explain further will take away from the beauty of the expression. So the conductor of the orchestral movement is the soul. We have to remember this much. Sri Aurobindo says, this soul movement, this soul rhythm is like wordless music. It's true, music endures, music enchants. Haven't we listened to Beethoven, who has charmed us with his eternal music and who composed divinely even when his hearing was greatly impaired? And of course, he composed from his inner spirit. Or else, how could he give us some of his best compositions when he was on the point of going deaf? So, music and poetry of this kind become possible when the metrical rhythm is taken up by the spiritual. And it is in these higher harmonies that the mantra is uttered. The music fit for the mantra becomes audible. As the creator is the soul, so is the listener. The listener of the mantra is the ear of the ear, the inner ear, the one who listens to all hearings. So listen to this. न तत्र चक्षुर्गच्छति न वाग्गच्छति नो मनः न विदयो न विजानीमो यथैतद् अनुशिष्यात्. What divine rhythm is here! There the eye goes not, nor speech, nor the mind. We know not, we understand not how one can teach this. So this is, the eternal rhythm. This is from the Kena Upanishad. So, so mantra expresses a deeper spiritual reality. And Sri Aurobindo tells us that this is possible only when the three highest intensities of poetic speech meet and merge to become one. And these are the highest intensity of rhythmic movement, the highest intensity of interwoven verbal form and thought substance of style, and the highest intensity of the soul's vision of truth. And all great poetry is the result of the fusion of these three intensities. And Sri Aurobindo dwells elaborately on rhythm and mantra in many of his chapters. And in the next talks, we shall continue our discussion on these important aspects of poetic creation. But uh, before I end today's talk, let me quote a couple of passages from Sri Aurobindo's poetry where we can feel the rhythmic utterance, where he's saying, that knew itself by its own timeless self, aware forever in its motionless depths, uncreating, uncreated, and unborn, the one by whom all live, who lives by none. So we cannot fail to notice the Upanishadic cast of these lines. And here's a similar passage from a later part of the book, and all these are from Sri Aurobindo's sublime creation, Savitri. In a later part of the book, he says, night is not our beginning nor our end. She is the dark mother in whose womb we have hid. Safe from too swift a waking to world pain, we come to her from a supernal light. By light we live, and to the light we go. So, thank you so much for today.